Good afternoon, and welcome to Catalan Cymru Version Sessions. This session will focus on Politics A2, and will be presented by me, Mr. Andrew Morel from Ysgol Uwchradd Llanidloes High School. The session will last around 45 minutes, and I will go through relevant subject content during it. If you've got any questions at all, please don't hesitate to post them in the top left-hand corner of the screen, and I'll try and answer them either today or next session. This session will be recorded, and the recording and all the relevant resources will be uploaded to the Catalan Cymru of the e-sgol website. So, let's go. Over the last 2 weeks, we've looked at liberalism, its fundamental values, ideas, and the Section A question. Last session then, we looked at conservatism, fundamental values and ideas, and then a Section B question. And today we're following that same pattern. We're going to look at socialism and communism, their fundamental values and ideas, before beginning to look at a Section C question. Next time then, you'll look at nationalism and continuing that build-up of a Section C question. So, what we'll do today is we'll have about 35 minutes focus on socialism and communism's fundamental values and ideas, and then there'll be a few minutes for questions at the end. If I don't get a chance to answer them even today, I will answer them next time. So these are, according to the specification, the fundamental values and key concepts of liberalism, right, in the first box here. This is what we looked at in the first week, and so we can kind of say we've done that. If you weren't here for it, then obviously feel free to look at the recordings on the Catalan Cymru website. There then are the conservatism ones, which we did last session. Here then are the socialism and communism ones, the ones that we're going to focus on today. Social democracy, democratic socialism and communism, gradualism, revolution, class conflict, social justice, equality, community, proletariat, and bourgeoisie. And as ever, we're going to focus on trying to define them and then link them together. Next time then we'll do exactly the same for nationalism. So just like with the other two sessions, I've set out your sheets, or I've asked you to set out a sheet like this, right, which has those key ideas or fundamental concepts and values in a kind of big A3 document like this, with which you can then write your definitions in and then make the links afterwards. So if you're watching this as a recording, then just pause it for a second, write these out in those boxes like that on a big A3 sheet or two A4 sheets together, and then restart it again to carry on the session. So our first key concept or key value is materialism. Marx claimed to have scientifically diagnosed the problems of capitalism, right? The problems of child labour, 12-hour working days, severe poverty of the Industrial Revolution. And he used this then to create a solution, which was communism. Now, I've used scientifically in apostrophes there because other people would actually suggest it wasn't scientific diagnosis, but nonetheless, he would say it was scientific diagnosis. And in order to scientifically diagnose, he used this concept of materialism to explain the economic system. Because what he did was he said that the base, the economy, the production of goods, shaped everything else, the superstructure, whether that's government, religion, law, education, culture, you name it. The economy shaped everything. Everything else was based on top of the economy. And this essentially meant that human history had always been a struggle over the oppressors, those in control of the methods of production, those in control of the economy, and the oppressed, those who didn't have control over the means of production. By diagnosing scientifically the human history as the base, the economy shaping everything else, then those people who are in control of the base, in control of the economy, in control of the methods of production, have then control over everything else in turn. And you can see that in this little picture in the top right hand here, the crank wheel of the bourgeoisie, of the factory owner onto the worker with the low wages, the high rent, you name it. So our kind of simple conception of materialism is Marx's theory of economic relations and the production of wealth shaping everything else in society. I emphasize in the everything else so much because that's what he means, everything else. So that's our first. Our second is alienation, and I like this one just really for the Charlie and Chocolate Factory reference, which I'll come to in a second. But essentially, Marx felt that your job, your labour, allowed you to showcase your ability. What you did allowed you to showcase your abilities and your talents, and ensure that work created you. So with the arrival then of machines in the Industrial Revolution, as an expression, or work as an expression of who you are, stopped. Because you ended up doing the same thing again and again and again. The repetition of controlling, of organizing a machine. And so labor became a commodity that was just simply bought and sold, not something that you did to create yourself, not something that was highly valued for the skills and you were irreplaceable, because you weren't. And this is where the Charlton Chocolate Factory reference comes in. In Charlton Chocolate Factory, his dad worked in a toothpaste factory, right? And as the clip in the film shows, and as the picture here shows, literally screwing tops on tubes of toothpaste. And this is that meaning of alienation, right? He looks bored, he looks fed up, he hates it, right? Because the machine is basically taking over and doing his job for him. It doesn't require the skill, the flair, the talent of a person to do it. It's something that ultimately he's replaced by a machine with. And that's alienation. You were then paid for the hours you spent doing the same repetitive work again and again, and so you became alienated from your work. That's what Marx says is the result of this industrial revolution, the result of these new machines. So in summary, alienation is the inability to create yourself in your work because of machines, because of the machines that have been invented throughout this industrial revolution. So there's alienation, our second. Our third is socialism, is revolution versus evolution, or gradualism versus evolution. And these all refer to the roads to socialism. Socialism, right, can be split into two strands or two ways to achieve it. Revolutionary on one side, it's like a junction in the road, isn't it? You can take one or other direction. And frankly, once you've started on that path, it's very hard to turn round. Because revolution is that violent overthrow. And that is communism or Marxism. Whilst gradualism, or the evolution, the slow and gradual change, is what your democratic socialists and social democracy would say. Now, once you've started on that revolution road, it's incredibly hard to turn around and go back to that democratic road. And that's why I'm talking about it being two road junctions. It's very hard to turn around quickly and go back. The key thing to remember is that socialism is always a force for change, no matter how they're doing it. But the disagreement here is how that change should occur. Should it be fast and punchy in a revolution, or should it be slow and gradual in evolution or gradualism? So revolution, quite simply, is a fundamental and irreversible systematic change, often a brief but dramatic period of upheaval, happens over a very short period of time. Whilst gradualism is achievement of socialism through gradual improvements rather than revolution. Change is brought about through legal and peaceful reform, often suggested to be via the ballot box elections. So building on these, right, if we're getting this concept of alienation and materialism, we need to understand that there then are two different groups. And those groups are your proletariat or your bourgeoisie. So according to Marx, capitalism is a regime dividing society into two main classes. Your bourgeoisie, the owners, the people that own the means of production, and your proletariat, the workers, the people that don't own the means of production. That are the people that would be screwing tops onto the toothpaste, right? Or replaced then by machines eventually. And Marx says that the exploitation of the proletariat is inevitable. It is inevitable that the bourgeoisie, the owners, are going to exploit the proletariat, because ultimately, the more you exploit the proletariat, the more the bourgeoisie can make money, can make material things, is what Marx would say. And this is where it links to false consciousness, because you'd have thought, right, if this was the case and everyone knew this was the case, why were the proletariat not standing up against these bourgeoisie? Why were they not stopping it? Well, Marx says it's because of this concept, this fundamental value, which is false consciousness. He reckons that the proletariat accepted this bourgeoisie rule, accepted this exploitation, and even considered it to be normal or even, in fact, desirable because of this concept of false consciousness. He argues that the proletariat are not conscious of their fate because everything, including the state, have persuaded them that they aren't a class with a common threat. And you can link this back to then materialism, can't you? Where you can say that the economy, the means of production, is the base for everything else. So Marx would say that if this base, this means of production, is owned by the bourgeoisie, then the bourgeoisie are going to turn everything else, the government, politics, religion, to their advantage, and they're going to use it to persuade people that actually the base isn't the thing that's the issue. The bourgeoisie isn't the thing that is the issue. And it links together really nicely at times. So, in summary, for your boxes, right? Proletariat, bourgeoisie, the class that sells its labour is the proletariat, the bourgeoisie, the ruling class of a capitalist society who own productive wealth. They're the people that own it. False consciousness then, the proletariat not understanding truly their exploitation by the bourgeoisie. They haven't truly understood what the bourgeoisie is doing to them. So, these all, as I said, link quite nicely, because our next one would be class conflict. Now, Marx believes, even wants, a conflict between these two classes, because one is the exploiter, the bourgeoisie, and one is the exploited, the proletariat, and there's always surely going to be a conflict between these. And he uses this to diagnose history. He says all major change has been due to economic arrangements creating a fundamental conflict, creating that fundamental divide, which means there is going to be a conflict. And Marx believes then that change will only happen when the proletariat see that there should be a conflict and, crucially, act on it to create a revolution. It isn't just being conscious of the fact that there is a conflict, but acting on it and doing something about it. So here we've got, right, this little kind of picture to the left, talking not a penny of the workers' wages, not a penny tax on food. This is them beginning to act on that conflict. But Marx might probably argue that this isn't acting on it enough, because this isn't creating a revolution. This isn't picking up arms and trying to forcefully redistribute property. But nonetheless, class conflict is another fundamental value. If the proletariat are being trampled on, exploited by the bourgeoisie, then surely they're going to rise up and do something about it. And so our summary of class conflict is this. It is the irreconcilable antagonism between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. You can't reconcile it because there is a fundamental relationship of exploiter versus exploited. So here we go. We're building up our idea of these different fundamental values and ideas in order to really explain socialism and communism, and to explain what comes later on in the specification as well. Social justice then, right? Justice in terms of distribution of privileges and material means of things in society. If things aren't just, then there isn't a fair distribution of things. There isn't a fair distribution of material things, but also there isn't a fair distribution of privileges in the society as well. So revolutionaries would completely demolish capitalism to establish an alternative communist society, so Marx would say. Whilst evolutionists would redistribute wealth through taxes, welfare, and benefits that bring a more socially just and fair world as a result. So they're both looking to achieve social justice, but how they do it, they say, is very, very different. Revolution is about seizing that capital, seizing that money, that property from the bourgeoisie, and then forcibly redistributing it. Whilst evolutionists would gather it through taxes and a welfare state. Tax the rich more, provide the poorer more with better welfare. That's how they would redistribute that wealth. And so social justice then is the morally justifiable distribution of wealth according to Marxism, usually implying a commitment to greater equality as a result. So they argue that this redistribution of wealth is moral. It is morally worthwhile because we're seeing greater equality as a result. So obviously, in order to truly define and understand social justice, we in turn need to define and understand equality. So equality refers, well, initially is the defining characteristic of socialism. And it refers to a way to ensure selfish and unfavorable behavior is prohibited. if we're being selfish, then we are being the opposite of equal. Because if we're being selfish, we're gathering it in for ourselves. They do not think then that everyone is the same, but that inequality is caused by society. The difference in material distribution of wealth, of privileges, is as a result of society, is as a result of capitalism's selfish and unfavorable behavior. Equality, so Marx and Engels in the Communist Manifesto in particular said, so they thought would improve solidarity and social cohesion as people will see what actually unites them, and they'll see that more. And this in turn, hopefully they feel, will help get over that concept of the false consciousness, because people are aware of the situation and aware that they're not equal, that they're not treated in an equal way. So our summary of equality is this, right? It's a fundamental value essential to ensuring social cohesion, justice, and freedom. So it's not just about people being equal. Communists would talk about it being important because it binds society together. It stops people feeling exploited. And so if you feel exploited, what are you going to do? Well, frankly, you are going to maybe turn to revolution, right? Hence what the communists would say they do in the first place. Ultimately, they want people to work together. They want social cohesion. They want justice. And they want freedom. And I think this brings us to our last value then, which is community. Community then, right, can see adversity being overcome by working together rather than as an individual. Humans are comrades, right, linked by common thing of being human, they would say. And that's the basis of community. And ultimately, humans and their nature is shaped by the community they're in. And so what we can see from socialism and Marxism is the idea, is the wish that this community of the proletariat is spread worldwide. And by spreading it worldwide, it helps then to shape the people to avoid that exploitation by the bourgeoisie. And this comes with this quote here on the right comes from John Donne between 1571 and 1631. So obviously writing a long time before Marx, but nonetheless kind of an early socialist tradition, or what Marx and Engels would have described as utopian socialism. And he said, "No man is an island entire of itself. Every man is a piece of a continent, a part of the main. Any man's death diminishes me because I'm involved in mankind, and therefore never send to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee." So any loss of life, any loss of someone in the community is a mournful act for everyone, because people are shaped by the community in which they're in. You might have heard the phrase, it doesn't take a person to raise a child, it takes a village to raise a child, or a community to raise a child. It's the same thing. We are products of our community, and so that's why they put such emphasis on community. But crucially, they don't limit it. They don't limit it to being Russia or Germany or Britain, as Marx and Engels first hoped communism and socialism would happen in. They don't limit it at all. They say, preferably, this is a worldwide community. And so community refers to then a principle based on the collective identity of a social group. That social group preferably being proletariat and preferably being global or worldwide. So, and if you're watching this on recording, right, a good chance to pause to make sure you've got these key definitions around in each of these boxes. These are those key definitions in that kind of same shape, the way that we're kind of setting them out in order to then facilitate in a minute making links between these different key concepts and fundamental values. So, as you can see, right, on the box at the top, we have initially in the boxes of each fundamental value defined the socialist or communist conception of it. What does it mean to socialism and communism? And that is really important to remember, is that you're doing it from that perspective. You are not doing it from the perspective of conservatism or liberalism. You're doing it from the perspective of communism and socialism. And our next task then is to connect each idea with arrows to show the links between it, and writing on the arrow what that link is in order to explain it, in order to fully explain it. So what we're going to do now is we're going to do some of that. We're going to highlight some of these connections. And these connections are really, really important. As I've said in previous sessions, it's like helping I don't know if you've seen Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock Holmes, he's got this mind palace, right? And there's one, I was trying to find the clip of it, and I couldn't quite find it. But there's this this clip where Sherlock Holmes is going into his mind palace. Dr. Watson tells everyone to get out. He needs to go into his mind palace. And what he's doing is, in his mind, he's picturing the different rooms that he's got this different information stored in. But between each of those rooms are these corridors. And those corridors are what linking this information up. And that's exactly what you're doing with these arrows. You're linking this information together to tie it together and ultimately to make it easier to deal with, not to prevent it from being too big a burden in terms of remembering everything. So let's start. Materialism. How can we link materialism? Well, we can link materialism to alienation, because this is the reason for it. If we didn't have materialism, there would be no need, or there would be no such thing as alienation. If we weren't material beings, if we weren't looking to produce things at a cheaper rate and introduce these machines, then we wouldn't have alienation. We wouldn't have that removal of our ability to create ourselves in our work. What about materialism and gradualism? Well, here, right, we've got the diagnostic. I apologize as ever for my writing. The diagnostic versus the reality or the solution. The diagnosis is materialism. The solution is gradualism. So you can see that pattern, and then by the same way, we can kind of extend that over to revolution, can't we? It is a solution of a different form, but nonetheless, it's still a solution. Is the idea. Okay, what about then? Let's go class conflict to bourgeoisie and proletariat. Well, it couldn't happen without each other. Without the class distinction, you couldn't have a class conflict. Without people identifying as proletariat and identifying as bourgeoisie, you couldn't have a conflict. But equally, flip on its head, right? Class conflict between bourgeoisie and proletariat, we wouldn't be able to almost have that clear distinction, according to Marx, without the conflict. The fact that one is the oppressor and the fact that one is the oppressed is what creates those two classes. And that in its very self is a conflict, isn't it? What about then? Let's go class conflict and equality. What's the link here? Well, we're thinking that equality could stop this. If there was genuine equality, then we wouldn't have the situation where we've got the two classes based on the oppressor versus the oppressed, and so there would be no need for class conflict. And that is the ultimate goal, I suppose, of socialism, through either revolution or gradualism, to achieve that equality, to prevent the need from class conflict. Build on this then. We can get one. Let's go alienation all the way around here to social justice. Now this, we are talking about the fact that the current system prohibits this. The current system that allows for the alienation of labour prohibits social justice, prohibits the fair distribution of privileges within a country. Because some people are still creating themselves in their work, while some people aren't. But more importantly, some people own the means of production and so are making money, whilst others are the wage labour, and so they are not making money. They are being oppressed, as linking back to the bourgeoisie and the proletariat again. Gradualism, revolution, link here, it is one or the other. As I said earlier, it is very hard once you've gone down that road of revolution. It is very, very hard to return down the road of gradualism. It's very hard to then justify it to the people that actually we want to know what you want to think. We want to go to the ballot box. So that's why I've said one or the other. And I think most Marxists Marxist socialists would agree with that. It is one or the other. You can't choose between the two. Let's go with this one, equality and community. Quite frankly, it couldn't happen without it. God, my handwriting is awful, but at least you can read it, hopefully. It's this pen on the screen. promise you. It's not that bad when I'm writing down on a piece of paper, honestly. So equality and community couldn't happen without. Well, if we think about it, we need community in order to work together to create equality. But more importantly, we need equality. We need people to have similar privileges. We need people to have social justice in order to create a community where everyone then is genuinely working together rather than being led, rather than being exploited. So equality is needed, according to Marxism, to create a community in the first place. I'm trying to think what other ones have I not got. Class conflict and revolution. Class conflict and revolution. It is the encourager. Class conflict encourages revolution. And that's the main reason why revolution occurs mainly rather than gradualism, is because class conflict has boiled over. It's encouraged that revolution to happen in the first place. If there wasn't a class conflict, if there wasn't that distinction, follow the arrow on, if there wasn't that distinction between proletariat and bourgeoisie, because if there was equality, then there would be no need for a revolution, argues Marx, argues Engels. False consciousness and your bourgeoisie, proletariat, right? The idea is to make them understand this. The idea of false consciousness, the importance of false consciousness to Marxists, is making people understand that there is a distinction between proletariat and bourgeoisie. There is a distinction, and so we must then do something about it. We must follow it through. We must then see the class conflict, and we must then take part in a revolution to overthrow it. I'm just double checking I've written some of these down. I just want to make sure I've got them all. Okay, so gradualism round to community. Gradualism relies on a steady community. It relies on a steady group of people that are willing to slowly or softly catch a monkey, that are willing to take step at a time in order to achieve these. Now, I think they are probably all the links I can think of. Now, you no doubt can think of more links, and the more links you can think of, the easier it'll be for you in terms of then identifying what you've got, what the links are, and how you can then remember these different elements. By linking these together, you are really proving that you understand the concepts in the first place, and then you are helping your memory in the situation as well. You're helping your understanding of the situation as well. There we go, right? You have explained those links, writing on the arrows, and hopefully better handwriting than me, you're explaining what those links are. So the last thing we're going to do then for the last 10 minutes is we're just going to think about a section C question. So we looked at section A in our first week, and we saw there were 16-mark questions. We saw that also you had to answer both of the questions that are in section A. Last session, when we were looking at conservatism, we looked at section B questions, 24-mark questions, and we saw that there's a bit of an element of choice. You answered 2 of the questions. Section C then is a single question, which you have to answer, and also, worryingly, it is 40 marks. So it is a massive hitter of a question. It's worth, well, more than section A put together, and almost as much as section B put together as well. So you need to really make sure you're leaving yourself enough time in the exam to do this. So how do you go about writing a good section C or a 40-mark essay question? Now, the example in this exam paper here, right, is socialism the most influential theory on Welsh politics. Evaluate this statement using your knowledge of political theories. We're not going to look at that one. We're going to look instead at this one, right? Nationalism has more contemporary relevance and influence than other political concepts or theories. Evaluate this statement using your knowledge of political theories. Now, the important thing to start with here on our packed model is the pressure of time. I'm going to sneeze, sorry. Apologies. Is the pressure of time, right? This is a 40-mark question, as I said, more than section A put together, almost as much as section B put together. And that means that you're going to need to spend 50 minutes on this essay. So it is a good chunk of time. and where part of this I would be dedicating 5 minutes planning time, because it would really, really pay dividends. It would really help you when you're writing this to have that structure, to have that idea of where you're going, to have that idea of how you're going to argue throughout whether or not nationalism has or doesn't have more contemporary relevance and influence than other political concepts and theories. So the pressure of time, very simple thing for me to say, but often not always followed, 50 minutes. Don't leave less than 50 minutes, because you will not be able to cover it all, and ultimately you won't be able to access top marks. So our next element of PACT is our assessment objectives. Now, this 40-mark question covers all three of the assessment objectives. It covers AO1, your kind of knowledge and examples. It covers AO2, your application of that knowledge. And it also covers AO3, your ability really to construct an argument. So let's pause for a second, right? Because these ideas are what gives you full AO1, AO2, and AO3 marks are the same, across these essays. Let's see what, from this mark scheme, it tells us you have to do to get full AO1 marks, AO2 marks, AO3 marks as well. So for AO1, right, in this case, it is 12 marks out of the 40. In AO1, it needs you to show thorough knowledge and understanding of the contemporary relevance and influence of nationalism and other political concepts. So knowledge and understanding there, isn't it? Knowledge, you demonstrate knowledge by using specific facts, specific examples, specific details. Evidence and examples used are well chosen. So that means they're specifically relevant to what you are talking about, the argument you're trying to make. Depth and range to material used. You're not just using one example and keeping referring to that example and being a bit kind of not looking at it in too much detail. Instead, you are diving into it, and you're providing a good range, whilst also using effective use of terminology. And that really, I suppose, is the main reason why I've chosen to focus these revision sessions on these concepts. Because rather than explaining what alienation means, just using the term alienation or class conflict, right? Using that is something they're looking for in AO1 marks as well. In terms of AO2, that application of your knowledge, right? You are looking at 14 out of the 40 marks. And this says then, thorough application of political knowledge and nationalism and other political concepts and theories to contemporary society. Thorough interpretation of political information. So you're not just stating the political information, you're interpreting it and you're using it. And thorough explanation of relevant similarities, differences, and connections. Now, the reason for that is because, as we'll see in a second, you need to not just look at nationalism in this essay. Every single 40 mark, every single section C essay will ask you to look at all of the ideologies or all of the political concepts: nationalism, socialism and communism, conservatism and liberalism. AO3 then finally, again, 14 marks. This is your ability to create an argument, essentially. And what it says is thorough analysis and evaluation of the contemporary relevance and influence of nationalism and other political concepts and theories. What's important to note there is contemporary, isn't it? So we're talking last 50 years tops. We're not talking the last 300 years. Thorough discussion and well-developed and balanced arguments. So discussion means you're looking at it from more than one side. You're going back and forth. Well-developed and balanced arguments means you're not always just saying nationalism is more contemporary, nationalism is more contemporary. You're recognizing, has more contemporary influence. You are recognizing that socialism does have some contemporary relevance, or conservatism does have some contemporary relevance. Structure is logical, so be clear in how you're setting out your paragraphs, and an appropriate conclusion is reached based on the evidence presented. And we'll look at this next time, but when we're thinking about our conclusion then, what it's not doing is introducing new evidence, because you're basing it on the evidence presented earlier on in the essay. So that then is where your marks are coming from. Okay, important to know where your marks are coming from, because then you can tailor what you're writing to those marks. So in terms of our C, our content, what things do we think we can include? Well, in order to begin this process, you need to explode the question. And so the words than other political concepts and theories, plus the fact that there are 40 marks for this, means it is absolutely essential that you discuss all 4 political concepts. You are not just discussing nationalism. So where it's talking about nationalism has more contemporary relevance than other political concepts, it is making you realize, it's pointing you in a direction of doing the 4. Because let's think about it, right? For example, if it said nationalism has contemporary relevance and influence, you'd only need to talk about nationalism, wouldn't you? Right? And that would just be a 10-mark question then. But when it's asking you, does it have more contemporary relevance than other political concepts and theories, you've got to discuss the others. You might not discuss them in quite as much depth as nationalism, but you are definitely still discussing them. And you must identify key aspects that are relevant today and compare them between the different political concepts. That might be the role of the state. That might be the role of individual freedoms. But they're things that are relevant today and things that you can then compare across the different ideologies and political concepts. And this is a thing that limits the content, right? Because if it didn't say contemporary, right, if it just said nationalism has more relevance and influence than any other political concept and theory, that essentially is inviting you to talk about everything you learned about nationalism, everything you learned about socialism, conservatism, liberalism. But when it's talking about contemporary, it means you're not needing to worry here about the foundations of these. You're not needing to worry about what's happening in the early 1900s. It means you're just looking at the information in the last 50 years tops, right? You know, it could be argued if you're talking about contemporary, you're talking about the last 20 years only, really. So as I say, then this limits the content you need, and historical information then isn't important here as a result. You don't need historical information in order to answer this question. You don't need what was happening in the Enlightenment. You don't need what was happening in nonconformity in order to answer this question. And so what I'd like you to do, right, or what I think will benefit you before then coming to next week's session or listening to the next recording, is to go over your work on Unit 3 and plan then what content you would include in this question. And what I've done, right, is I have put in the next slides, which we'll discuss as we go. On the next slides, I've put some resources, some spider diagrams almost, to help you with that content. And I've broken it down, as you'll see, I've broken it down into each of the 4 political concepts, right? So start with nationalism, because that's the one that's in the question, before then going on to those others and asking you to do vaguely the same things for each. So this is a really good, I would say, really good planning tool for your Section C question, for your 40-mark essay question. Where it says nationalism, it's asking you then to do this, right? For example, examples of the upsurge of nationalism in the late 20th and 21st century, resulting in wars and boundary changes. Examples of this, you could think of Russian annexation of Crimea, for example. You could think of the freedom in the same area of the world of the Donbass region, the attempts for freedom there, or independence, I should say, not freedom, independence. Debates about whether nationalism is more destructive than creative. Political thinkers are key here, right? And this is something I've not mentioned before, actually, that political thinkers, your key thinkers, are absolutely essential to be introducing in your Section C essay. Debates about government exploitation of nationalist symbols, such as flags, anthems, etc., for political purposes. Contemporary relevance of civic nationalism and active citizenship. Things that are making nationalism relevant today, because ultimately your argument is nationalism more or less relevant, more or less influential than other contemporary ideologies. Argument of how national consciousness is created, and examples of the upsurge of nationalism in the late 20th and 21st century in proposed nation states and regional struggles. Brexit referendum could be an example of that, couldn't it, right? The not necessarily proposed nation states, but regional struggles or wish to return sovereignty. Central conservatism, right? Trying to get you to think almost in the same way. Contemporary examples of conservatism as the dominant political concept or ideology. If you compare that, we're thinking about, in comparison to the examples of the upsurge in nationalism. Debates about longevity of conservatism. Extent to which conservatism links to nationalism. Additional liberal ideas to debate the idea of what political concept is more contemporary and has more relevance and influence. Conservative political thinkers with contemporary ideas or ideas that are not overtly challenged by contemporary ideas. Conservatism, many people would consider to be one of the older of these ideologies, of political concepts, and so we've got to think about making sure it's relevant to today. And examples of the upsurge of conservatism, in the late 20th and 21st century. So what I'm asking you to do then is the same for all of these. By brainstorming here, you're focusing on the contemporary influence of each of these different political concepts, whether that's socialism, liberalism, etc. And by brainstorming in the same sort of way, it gives you some features around which you can directly compare. The upsurge, the details about its importance, the role of it in the 21st century. So all of these then are inviting you to do exactly that. What we've done today then is we have successfully covered, hopefully in your minds as well, the social democracy, democratic socialism and communism ideas, gradualism versus revolution ideas, and those key concepts of class conflict, social justice, equality, community, proletariat, and bourgeoisie as well. So you can tick that off your revision list, right? You've done a cracking job at it, and you understand that, which will help apply it, or help you be able to apply it to other aspects of the specification. Okay, concepts of economic socialism, that is going to be massively linked to materialism, massively linked to equality, massively linked to alienation as well. And lastly then, right, just a reminder, like I've said in previous weeks, of where you can find some specific resources for this. Okay, this website here, which on the resource on the PowerPoint uploaded to the e-sgol website or Catalan Cymru website will be clickable, will take you to a website that's specifically designated for revision for topic on all of these four political concepts. Okay, it has got absolutely everything you need to know in terms of these concepts for this exam. It is very, very good. And also, obviously, these sessions aren't focusing on Unit 4. So this other link here, resource on the WJC website, takes you to that, takes you to some Unit 4 content. It also gives you some interactive content revision and also an exam walkthrough as well, which is really useful for you as well. So thank you very much for tuning in for today's session on socialism and communism, its fundamental values and ideas. Next time then, we'll be looking at nationalism. And then we'll finish off the section C question. We'll be looking at things to note, and we'll try and just perfect that section C, so you've got a better idea of how it is you're answering it when you get to that exam or when you're practicing by writing some past paper questions. So the last thing to say is any extra questions, please just use these last few minutes now to ask them in a question answering function, and I'll pool them all together and answer them then in readiness for the next session. Thank you very much, and good luck with your revision. Keep working hard, and hear from you next week.